Filmed on location at our beautiful Old Westbury 604-acre campus, we offer a variety of majors to choose from and a wonderful opportunity to discover the leader in you. Please visit us at oldwestbury.edu. When can you start?
Good evening, ladies and gentlemen. Welcome to another program in our series, Living on Long Island. Today we will analyze the 50th anniversary of the assassination of President John F. Kennedy and why it has such an impact even today. I am honored to have three guests who will share their personal recollections of the late president and also give me and the audience their reflections on that horrible day in Dallas. My guests are Dr. Anthony Haynor, Associate Professor at Seton University. Tony, you teach sociology, right? Mr. Henry Boitel, attorney in Rockville Center and the president of the RVC Democratic Club. And Dr. Howard Ehrlich, Professor of History and Education at St. John's University and former Executive Director of the Theodore Roosevelt Association. I got that all right?
You got it.
If you had any more things, I wouldn't. It would be tough. Okay. In a previous show, we discussed Theodore Roosevelt, the only president from Long Island. John F. Kennedy was not from Long Island. No roots here, even though Jacqueline, I think, was born on Long Island or lived in Long Island, his wife. But there are parallels between JFK and Theodore Roosevelt, aren't there?
There are many parallels. They both came from wealth. They both had illnesses which tended to impact their ability to perform, but I would say that Theodore Roosevelt's illnesses were more substantial and impacted him less. They both were involved with Cuba in a rather historic way. And they both were confronted with issues of reform. Unfortunately, whereas Teddy Roosevelt had a life which I think I described in our last performance as being a series of operas, and doing, I mean, he accomplished things, whereas JFK in the short time that was available to him was more like a musical with a lot of hope. And unfortunately, that hope was extinguished before he could really meet the test of time in terms of what he could actually accomplish. But one thing he certainly accomplished was to give a good injection to the national spirit. There was this sense of youth, this sense of hope, this sense of we can do it, this sense that we can get to the moon, we can do all those kinds of things. Some of the same things that Teddy Roosevelt would have inspired.
And of course, in terms of age, Theodore Roosevelt, youngest president, John F. Kennedy, youngest elected president. They both went to Harvard, right? So there are some parallels. Theodore Roosevelt began the modern press conference, and John F. Kennedy actually mastered the press conference. So in many ways, there are some parallels. So why today, after 50 years, why is this assassination, that horrible day in Dallas, why has it had such an effect?
The loss of this charismatic leader, leader who, as Henry mentioned, encouraged young people to get involved in politics, Peace Corps, amongst other things. People thought of him as a member of their family, if you will. And this sudden shock on November 22nd, 1963, was unbearable for a lot of people. Where they were at the time, what the news was, in the 4 days that followed this. Everyone knows where they were, glued to the television. Television came into its being. The news came to its being, I think, at that time, covering this event. And I think your points are well mentioned. I think that this inspiration, the Camelot era, and Jackie's beautiful wife and his lovely family, people identify with that. And he had this wit about him and a sense of humor If you look at those press conferences, the old tapes of it, it's wonderful to see this.
Very self-deprecating.
Yes,
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 yes.
And who was that woman in the front, the reporter in the front?
May Craig.
May Craig.
She used to bid him on and everything else. Yeah. It was wonderful seeing that. But he was a master of that.
Tony, why, growing up as a Catholic young man, did his religion have something to do with your affinity for him, or was it his youth, or a combination?
It's interesting, as I was very young, but probably the two most influential people at a very early age were JFK and John the 23rd.
Okay.
So they influenced me a lot. I think two other factors I think are worth mentioning. One is that one of the largest, perhaps the largest demographic group are the baby boomers, right? And so I think the baby boomers, for the baby boomers, I think JFK had a special place, right? People who were born, late 40s through the 50s. So that age group, that cohort, I think were particularly influenced by the Kennedy years. And as you get older, you just don't leave that behind. That's an important part of your youth, your formation. And the other thing I think, and many commentators have made this point, that the Kennedy assassination represented sort of the end of innocence, because right after that you had, even though Kennedy was involved in the early stages of the civil rights movement, but we had civil rights, we had the Vietnam protests, and so things became, or the perception was that things became unhinged after he died, and we entered this very turbulent era in the United States.
Dr. Haynor mentioned some good points, Henry, but it seems like the more we learn about him, and some of his private life and other things weren't so grand, but it seems like the more we learn about him, the public doesn't seem to affect the public. If you do poll after poll on greatest presidents of the modern presidency, he is classified as one of the best presidents. What is it about him that he cannot, he cannot be hurt?
Well, I think the fact that he was assassinated, the tragic circumstances under which his presidency was brought to an end, play some role in that. I think what we were talking about before, he is probably the last president, at least in my lifetime, who gave this sense of national spirit to us. We've never had it quite the same. We've had scandals in the presidency. Sure, we've learned something about the personal life of John Kennedy, but most people have gone beyond that. I mean, that's not the standard upon which we're judging presidents. We're judging presidents on how they can fulfill the duties of their office. And we had the sense that he could do it. He just never had the full opportunity to do it. Though he had, the situation in Cuba was most unfortunate, yet despite the poor planning that was involved there, his reputation for most in terms of being a great president, or a person who unfortunately was killed early, has survived. So I think this sense of hope, unfortunately, many people who have since been born weren't quite exposed to that. I don't know how young people, perhaps you who are teaching have a better sense of how he is received by students today. But those of us who have the memory of the times certainly remember a better time than we are in today.
Going from all the way down, give me your personal recollection of the president, either in person or something you heard or whatever.
I'll give you a quick story. My father was working in Manhattan, and he'd come home, and here's another thing, we all had dinner together. That's very rare. We had a family to have your dinner together. And we all had to wait for my dad to come home and have dinner. And he'd go around the table and ask what we did and so forth and so on. But that night, he comes home and he says, I got a great story to tell you. I said, what? I was on the Long Island Expressway, and they shut down the other lanes of the expressway, and we see this police coming in motorcade. It was President Kennedy. And apparently the motorcade had stopped at one point, and he was on the opposite side, and he rolled down the window and he says, "Hi, Jack." And he waved and smiled to my dad. Well, that story I just retained as a kid, and my brothers, you know, we just remember that one thing. You met the President of the United States, and it was John Kennedy, which we all love very much.
As a college student, I went to St. John's undergraduate in Brooklyn at the time. Yes, where Howard now teaches, but he teaches out on the campus. Right. As a college student, I was active in political matters and campaigned for the Kennedy in the Kennedy campaign, and then some of us recall, or many of us recall, the situation when he went to Berlin. We had the Berlin Wall situation, and the Ich bin ein Berliner, and the great international attention that was focused, because again, television was really coming into its own then, and so everything he did was magnified much more than prior presidents. So Willy Brandt, the mayor of West Berlin, thereafter sent a delegation of student and youth leaders to the United States. And as I said, I was active in those kinds of things at the time. I was asked to escort these people around the country. And there was a point that we had a conference at the White House. And one of the things that is very dear to me and my family is this picture. In the White House, we had just been in the cabinet room where we had a meeting with various White House officials and State Department people, and then came out, and this is a room called the Fish Room. And in this picture, there's a few people. There's myself and the student and youth leaders, and Barbara Boggs, who was the daughter of Senator Boggs, and Ed Garvey, who later ran for senator in Wisconsin and was also head of the national, I guess it was the Football Players Association. And it was a grand moment, one you never forget, you know, being in the president's presence of the President of the United States, and that's one of my fond memories.
And Tony, tell us your story of the president-elect at the time. No, not yet elected president.
As a very young boy, I think one of his last campaign stops in 1960 was to the Staten Island ferry terminal, and my dad put me on his shoulders to, I think, shake his hand. Right, so I have a vague recollection of that.
It is vague because I'm the one who put.
I was on your shoulder.
You're on my shoulder. That's okay.
It's very vague.
That's
right,
okay.
Right. So, but one thing that
he's not heavy, he's my brother.
That's right. Right. That's right. But you mentioned the Cuban Missile Crisis. I think one of his one of the qualities I think that was most appealing about him was that he accepted full responsibility. That I remember. And you mentioned, well, I think in the previous program about Teddy Roosevelt being sort of militaristic and then being involved in diplomacy and so on. Is that consistent? Well, Kennedy basically entered office as a hawk.
Yes. What we call a hawk
right,
now. Yeah.
Right. But then you had the famous American University speech, the nuclear
test ban treaty.
Test ban treaty, yeah. Right? So so he was evolving in office. And I think that's another reason it was so painful.
That's a good point.
To him because we don't know where he would have.
He was a different president his third year than the first year.
Absolutely.
But it's amazing, and I think in your personal life, I know in mine, I really noticed this. Anything that is history around that time. In other words, a movie will come on TV, 1964. Instinctively, I will say that was after President Kennedy died. It's amazing. That's the first thing I think of. 63, who won the World Series? Oh, that was the year President Kennedy died. That date, everything before and after, it revolves around that date. That's why that's so important. Go ahead, I'm sorry.
Yeah, I just want to mention, I think I had a chance to meet Carolyn Kennedy. She had written a book for children, and went up to her, and I actually had a photograph of her mother, Jacqueline Kennedy, which I admired greatly. And I didn't know what to say, so I just went up to her and I said, "Look, I have to say this to you. Your mother was a very classy First Lady. She entered that office with grace, dignity, and I love what President Kennedy said that morning at Fort Worth, Texas, at that breakfast meeting, that fateful day on November 22nd. He comes in, and then Jackie Kennedy comes in with that beautiful pink suit and the pillbox hat, and she sits down and makes his grand entrance. She was a little bit late that morning, and President Kennedy gets up there in his breakfast meeting and says, "You know, nobody cares what Lyndon and I wear. I only care what my wife wears." This is the kind of thing that I always remembered, and I think of that, and when I said to Carolyn, to her mother, was very classy.
And it's funny, after all those years, all of us have moved different places, most of us, different locations. We've thrown out some things. I have a photograph of Life magazine in 1963, him and the president and Jackie coming off the plane. That I made sure, no matter where I moved, I kept.
Arriving at Love Field.
Arriving at Love Field. I have a book called 4 Days, the Inaugural Spectacle. I still have that. Certain things have come and gone since that, but certain things I have kept. And for some reason, something told me to keep those, and I never would part with it.
In a sense, it seems as if it were yesterday.
And sometimes you see the pictures in black and white, it seems like 100 years ago, and sometimes it seems like, yes, yesterday. That's true.
I'd like to show something. You mentioned about that. We mentioned this. You can get a hold of this. This is a change of address card sent by the Kennedy family moving into the White House. You know, people send out these cards. So they say, here, change of address, and you can see that's 1600 Pennsylvania Avenue, things like that. I think also that when you mentioned about things you saved, I think we all have things that we've saved. And there was a little, coincidentally, a doll that came out on a rocking chair. It played Happy Days We're Here Again. I have to have one of those. And after that, the manufacturer was told by the Kennedy family not to put them out anymore. Now they're collector's items and things like that. I'm sure we all have things that we have in our house about the Kennedy.
How about that horrible day? Any recollections of anything strike you, even now, looking at November 22nd, 1963? Are there any memories or anything that really stands out even today?
If I may, I did a presentation celebrating the 50th anniversary at another college nearby. And I had to interview Clint Hill, who was the Secret Service agent who jumped on the limousine, pushed Jackie Kennedy back into the limousine. And I interviewed him, and I said to him, you know, about the bubble of the car, would that have helped? You know, there's still controversy about that. It was a sunny day, it had rained earlier. But there's a very famous photograph, which I'm going to show in just a minute, if I could, about the shots, where they were fired from, the Texas School Depository Building. And all the conspiracy theories have come out and so forth and so on. And he said there's a very famous shot that's taken, I'll show it to you in a minute. If you look at this photograph, Clint Hill is looking toward the Texas School Depository Building as well as people in the crowd. So they know the shot came from the rear. Let me just show you this photograph. You can see the agents here, okay, looking toward the building, people in the crowd looking back behind them. Clint Hill said he never recovered from that moment, that time period. Alcohol, other things, Great Depression. And it took him years to get over it. He actually had to resign from the Secret Service at one point. So it did affect not just us, American people, but people who were there. And it took them years, and they finally got a reunion together, the Secret Service agents who were there. They went down to the Dallas Texas School Depository Building, and they all realized there was nothing they could do at that particular point, the way the Secret Service was mandated at that point.
Where were you that day? And then, Henry, I want to hear you.
I was in college, okay, in my dormitory, and
Friday afternoon.
Friday afternoon, and people coming down the hall said the president was shot, and I said, "Stop! You can't go kid about that. It's horrible." And of course, then we were all glued to the TV after that.
I was at Notre Dame Law School in my second year, had just been married the prior August, and my wife, of course, was with me, and unfortunately, she had a case of appendicitis early in the marriage, and she was home rather than teaching as she should have been. And why do I raise this? I raise this just it brings things a little bit in perspective. We had no television. In order for me to look at television, I had to leave my wife and go back to school and go to the student lounge where there was a television that we could look at. We didn't have any of the electronics that we see today and we take for granted. One of the things that strikes me as you talk about it was how different the times were in many ways, including this access to communications and electronics.
Tony?
A few years ago, I had occasion to go to Dealey Plaza, and I went to the what is now a museum, so I was able to actually look out the window that from which Oswald delivered the fatal shots, and that was a very moving experience. I stood on the grassy knoll, so I got a good view of Zapruder's angle. So I recommend anyone who's in Dallas to check that out, because that was a very meaningful experience. The other comment I would make about that is, it just, by today's standards, this the Secret Service operation on that day was very, very lax. Like today, wouldn't all of those windows have been sealed? And I mean, that just wouldn't have happened.
The major point here, you know, sewers would have been sealed, buildings would have been gone through. The advance team was a handful of men. The Secret Service at the time was literally a handful. The protection detail of the president was very, very small. You know, everything about this. You know, if you look at that photograph again, the police officers were told to stay behind the limousine, not on the side. They wanted a good view of President Kennedy to the crowd. There were so many things that you realized about that. You know, about who should have been there, who should not have been there, and so forth, the route he took, and so forth, and so on.
And Kennedy seemed to have had a strong fatalistic streak. Wasn't he not quoted as saying at one point, well, if somebody wants to get me, they'll get me? So I think he, maybe his health issues played into that, just live life to the full for as long as it lasts.
And he had lost siblings young also.
He didn't expect to live a long life. So I don't know, that seemed to be part of his mentality.
It's ironic that the last words that he heard were really from Nellie Cowling, the governor of Texas' wife, who just turned around and said to him, "You can't say the people of Texas don't love you." And then those first shots rang out.
I remember I was in high school at the time, and I went in Brooklyn, and I lived in Staten Island. I remember that ferry ride home. I have the quietest thing I've ever seen. It's just,
you could hear a pin drop.
Nobody talking. It was just.
Can we talk a bit about 50 years later?
Sure.
50 years later, what's the situation with Cuba? Have we made much progress in terms of restoring our relations with that country to our south? 50 years later, what's the situation with youth? What are the opportunities available for them? Back in those days, one had the sense that it was just there waiting for you. Now, we have people going to college and not being able to get jobs. The question of international affairs, I mean, the situation with the Middle East, some of which finds its roots in policies that were in effect and formed in those days, and which probably were not for the best. Civil rights, have we made 50 years worth of progress in civil rights? We have this issue right now with surveillance, where we find that our telephone calls and, or the data connected with our telephone calls and other things is being all stored in some mysterious building out in the West. Well, it turns out that back in those days, the Kennedys and their administration were equally involved in a program that had been ongoing for prior presidencies, going back to the end of the Second World War, in terms of infiltration of student groups and labor groups and the press, that was later exposed in the 70s. These are situations. The more we look at it, the more we see things haven't changed all that much, except in some areas things have gotten worse, at least for us.
But again, some of those things, and that's a very good point you mentioned, some of the things we talked about, and you mentioned 50 years ago, even though as president he was very cautious about many things. He waited, but it doesn't seem to affect his legacy at all.
But I think at that point about, he says in his inauguration speech, a torch has been passed to a new generation. And that's what he's talking about, the young people. And you mentioned that we teach in college, the Peace Corps and other things such as that, getting young people involved. I think that's something that we're lacking as well. We do have a problem with young people getting jobs. They go train, they don't get the job they were trained for. I think this is something we need, call to the new generation of people that he had, and people inspired to, whether it be the space program, you mentioned that before, helping impoverished countries, whatever it may be. I don't see that.
One of the reasons I think young people today may not be able to relate to JFK is that when I even mention in class the Cold War, they don't remember. They were born after the fall of the Soviet Union. But growing up during the Kennedy years, the Cold War was a big, big deal. I mean, that was like that tended to frame our lives. I recall as a young child, the air raid drills, hiding under the desks, but that was part of our everyday reality. We knew that there was this Cold War, and the Kennedy administration was definitely part of that period. And I'm not sure young people today really relate to the severity of that.
On the other hand, I read something the other day which was an interesting comment, and that is that while we, in growing up, had to hide under desks because we were afraid of nuclear war, the nuclear war never came. However, kids nowadays are being trained in order to take precautionary methods for people with guns coming into school facilities. So the kind of environment we were exposed to, the kids nowadays are being exposed to in an even more real way than we were.
And they're growing up in a post 9/11 situation,
right.
So that's their sort of defining moment. So
I just feel, again, not to be melodramatic, I don't think we've ever recovered from this assassination. I don't think we ever will. I think at that time, again, polls and the way people were, it seemed like at that time, for those few years, most people thought the country was going to get better. The future was going to be better. Subsequent presidents haven't given that feeling. And you mentioned the inaugural speech. I will throw down the gauntlet for all three. Since that President Kennedy inaugural speech, if you can quote one line from any inauguration speech since, I'll give you whatever.
They're forgettable, right, in many ways.
Was it the way he delivered the speech, the way the speech was written, the words used?
He seized the moment, you see, and knew how to articulate what people were hungering for. And it's hope, you see. He gave us hope. He gave us the willingness to compete, with ourselves, in fact, not even with others, with ourselves.
I have to play the if game again, gentlemen. I'm sorry. Had he not been assassinated and was reelected in 1964, how different would our country have been?
Well, there's a book by, I think Greenberg, Greenfield. Right. Process of reading it now. What if? Very quickly.
That has to be, you got 10 seconds and we'll have to continue this in another show.
So the what if? Question, I would think Vietnam War is the major thing. Would we have gone to Vietnam the way it was? I think he was gathering information at that particular point. Whether or not we would have gone to the scale that LBJ got us into with 500,000, I doubt it. But again, it's a what if kind of situation.
I want to thank my special guest, and I want to thank Sherry Baker for running this terrific studio, and Old Westbury for providing it, and Dave White for the camera. For Howard, Henry, and Tony, I wish you a good evening and a better tomorrow.